Hey there, and welcome to Crime for Sleep. I know you're having trouble falling asleep, so let me keep you company with true crime stories from around the world. Before we dive in, I'm curious, where did you first hear this one? If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Now get comfortable, and let's get into tonight's case. Story 1. The Unlit Hours. The entry points were partially secured, with the main access left ajar by approximately 4 inches. Interior examination revealed consistent orderliness, with no visible disturbances in the alignment of furnishings or personal effects. A single chair appeared slightly out of its expected position, rotated counterclockwise with no associated scuffing on the floor. The illumination was absent, yet the power was verified as active through a functional wall outlet. Surfaces remained free of dust accumulation, suggesting recent activity, though there was no verified presence. The chronological sequencing of events remains indistinct due to a lack of external timestamps. No residues or prints were discernible by standard detection methods, and yet the scent of extinguished candles lingered persistently. I read that report 17 different occasions before the words began to lose their clinical meaning and transform into something else entirely. Something that made my hands shake as I held the manila folder. The paper felt heavier than it should have, weighted with implications I wasn't ready to understand. My supervisor handed me this case on a Tuesday morning that felt like any other Tuesday morning until it didn't. She placed the folder on my desk with the kind of careful precision people use when they're handling something fragile or dangerous. Her fingers lingered on the edge longer than necessary. "This one's different," she said, and the way her voice dropped made me look up from my coffee. "The family requested you specifically." That should have been my first warning. Families don't usually request specific investigators unless they know something we don't, unless they have reasons that go beyond professional competence and venture into territory that makes everyone uncomfortable. The missing person was a woman in her early 30s who lived alone in a residential area where nothing interesting ever happened until it did. Her neighbors described her as quiet, polite, the kind of person who kept her lawn maintained and her garbage bins properly positioned. She worked from her home office, designing websites for small businesses, which meant her daily routine was predictable in the way that made her absence immediately noticeable. Her sister called it in after she failed to respond to messages for 3 consecutive days. Not unusual for most people, but this woman responded to everything within hours. Her sister knew something was wrong the same way you know when the temperature drops before a storm arrives. I drove to the house on a morning when the sky looked like old concrete. The neighborhood felt suspended in that particular kind of suburban stillness where every lawn mower and dog bark carries further than it should. Children's bicycles lay abandoned on driveways, their bright colors somehow muted under the gray light. The house stood at the end of a cul-de-sac, surrounded by others just different enough to avoid monotony but similar enough to feel interchangeable. 2 stories, beige siding, black shutters that had been recently painted. A small garden in front showed signs of recent attention, with freshly turned soil around the base of rose bushes that were just beginning to bloom. I walked the perimeter before entering, noting the windows that were closed and locked, the back door that showed no signs of forced entry, the small deck where a coffee mug sat beside a folded newspaper. The mug was clean, as if it had been washed and placed there deliberately rather than abandoned after use. Inside, the house felt like a held breath. Everything was exactly where it should be, which somehow made it feel more wrong than if it had been ransacked. The living room contained a sofa with throw pillows arranged symmetrically, a coffee table with magazines stacked according to size, and that single chair rotated just enough to suggest someone had been sitting in it recently, watching something or someone. The kitchen showed no signs of interrupted meal preparation. No dirty dishes in the sink, no food left out to spoil, no indication of sudden departure. The refrigerator hummed steadily, its contents organized with the kind of precision that suggested routine rather than obsession. Milk that would expire soon, leftovers in clear containers labeled with contents and dates, vegetables still fresh enough to use. Upstairs, the bedroom was equally undisturbed. The bed was made with military corners, clothes hung in a closet according to color and season, dresser drawers closed completely with no items protruding. A book lay open on the nightstand, a bookmark placed carefully between pages that showed no sign of being read recently. But it was the home office that made me pause. The computer was off, which seemed inconsistent with someone who worked from home and lived online. The desk was clear except for a notepad with the top sheet torn off, leaving faint impressions of writing that I couldn't decipher without proper equipment. A coffee cup sat beside the keyboard, empty but stained, suggesting it had been used and cleaned but not put away. I spent hours in that house, photographing everything, taking notes, trying to find some indication of what had happened or where she might have gone. The silence was complete except for the normal sounds of a house settling, the refrigerator cycling, the heating system maintaining temperature. No music, no television background noise, no indication that anyone had been living their normal life when whatever happened began to happen. The candle scent bothered me most. It wasn't overwhelming, just persistent enough to notice, sweet enough to be pleasant under different circumstances. I searched every room for candles, but found none. No holders, no matches, no lighters, nothing to suggest she used candles regularly. Yet that scent remained, strongest in the living room near the rotated chair, fainter but still detectable throughout the rest of the house. I interviewed the neighbors over the following days, sitting in their kitchens and living rooms, drinking coffee from mismatched mugs, listening to their theories and observations. They all said variations of the same thing. She was quiet, kept to herself, seemed nice enough when you saw her getting mail or taking out trash. No visitors they could remember, no loud noises, no disturbances. The neighbor directly across the street, an elderly man who spent most of his retirement watching the neighborhood through his front window, provided the most detailed account. He remembered seeing her car in the driveway that final morning, remembered thinking it was unusual because she usually left early to run errands. He remembered the mail truck arriving and leaving mail in her box, which she normally retrieved immediately. She was particular about her mail, he said, stirring sugar into his coffee with slow, deliberate movements. Always got it right away, like she was expecting something important. But that day, the mail stayed in the box. He noticed because he noticed everything, and the white envelopes protruding from the black mailbox bothered him in the way small disruptions of routine can bother people who pay attention to patterns. He didn't see her leave, didn't see anyone arrive, didn't hear anything unusual. The house simply transitioned from occupied to empty without any visible moment of change, like a photograph where someone present in one frame has vanished from the next. I pulled her phone records, bank statements, credit card transactions, all the digital breadcrumbs that modern life leaves behind. Everything stopped simultaneously, as if she had simply stepped out of existence rather than going somewhere else. Her last phone call was to her internet service provider, a routine inquiry about her bill that lasted 4 minutes and contained nothing unusual. Her last purchase was groceries, items consistent with someone planning to be home for several days. Her computer, when the tech department finally cracked the password, revealed a life lived largely online but without drama. Work emails, client communications, social media interactions that were friendly but not intimate. She maintained professional relationships with clients, casual friendships with people she had never met in person, and a digital presence that suggested contentment rather than crisis. But buried in her browser history, I found something that made me sit back in my chair and stare at the screen until my eyes watered. Searches for missing person cases, dozens of them going back months. Not random searches, but specific cases, detailed investigations into disappearances that had never been solved. She had been researching people who had vanished without explanation, people whose cases shared certain characteristics with her own eventual disappearance. The pattern was subtle but consistent. Adults living alone, no signs of struggle, no clear motive for leaving, houses left in perfect order. She had bookmarked news articles, saved police reports, created folders of information about cases that had gone cold. It was as if she had been studying her own future disappearance, learning from the failures of other investigations. I printed everything, creating files that grew thick with information that led nowhere but suggested everything. The cases she had researched spanned multiple jurisdictions, different demographics, various circumstances, but they all shared that same quality of incompleteness that made them impossible to solve and impossible to forget. Her sister agreed to meet me at a coffee shop that smelled like burnt beans and unfulfilled ambitions. She was younger, more animated, the kind of person who gestured while talking and made eye contact that lasted just long enough to be comfortable. She ordered something complicated with multiple modifications, while I stuck to black coffee that tasted like it had been sitting too long. She was always interested in mysteries, her sister told me, wrapping her hands around her cup as if seeking warmth on a day that wasn't particularly cold. Even as a kid, she read detective novels, watched true crime shows, followed cases in the news. I used to tease her about it, said she was morbid. But recently her sister had noticed a change in these interests. What had been casual entertainment became focused research. She stopped talking about the cases she was following, stopped sharing interesting articles or discussing theories. Her fascination with mysteries became private, almost secretive. I asked her about it once, her sister continued, staring into her coffee as if it might contain answers. She said she was thinking about writing a book, maybe freelancing for one of those crime podcasts. It made sense, you know. She was a good writer, did research for her web design clients all the time. But when I asked to see any notes or drafts related to this supposed book project, her sister's expression shifted. There were no notes, no drafts, no communications with publishers or podcast producers. The research existed in isolation, without apparent purpose or intended outcome. That's what worries me, her sister admitted. She was planning something, but I don't think it was a book. I returned to the house multiple times, each visit revealing details I had missed previously. The coffee mug on the back deck was positioned exactly where someone sitting in the chair would place it for easy access. The newspaper was folded to the crime section, with one article about an unsolved disappearance circled in pencil so lightly it was barely visible. Inside, I found more subtle indicators of interrupted routine. A pen lying on the kitchen counter with its cap beside it rather than attached. A sweater draped over the back of a dining room chair, positioned as if someone had just removed it. Small things that suggested normal life continuing until it didn't. The rotated chair became an obsession. I measured its position, photographed it from multiple angles, tried to determine what someone sitting in it would be looking at. The angle pointed toward the front window, providing a clear view of the street and the neighbor's house across the way. Someone had been watching, waiting for something or someone. I interviewed her clients, hoping to find some professional connection that might explain her disappearance. They described her as reliable, creative, easy to work with. She delivered projects on schedule, communicated clearly, charged reasonable rates. Several mentioned that she had recently asked unusual questions about their businesses, questions that went beyond what she needed for website design. One client who owned a small bookstore remembered her asking about security systems, whether he had cameras, how he kept track of who came and went. Another, who ran a consulting firm, said she had inquired about background checks, whether he investigated potential employees, how much personal information he typically gathered. It seemed like professional curiosity, the bookstore owner told me, arranging and rearranging the same stack of books while we talked. She said she was thinking about expanding her services, maybe offering security consulting along with web design. Made sense to me. But these conversations had occurred in the weeks before her disappearance, and none of her clients had heard from her about actually implementing such services. The questions existed without follow-up, like research without application. I requested surveillance footage from businesses in her neighborhood, hoping to trace her movements during those final days. Most cameras faced parking lots or entrances, providing limited views of the residential street where she lived. But one camera, mounted on a gas station 3 blocks away, captured vehicles traveling the main road that led to her neighborhood. The footage was grainy, time-stamped, boring in the way that surveillance footage always is until it isn't. I watched hours of cars passing, delivery trucks, school buses, the mundane traffic of suburban life. Her car appeared regularly, following predictable patterns consistent with someone who worked from home but ran errands during off-peak hours. But in the final week, her travel patterns changed. She made trips during unusual hours, took routes that didn't lead to her normal destinations, appeared to be driving without specific purpose. The last footage showed her car returning home late in the evening, much later than her usual schedule, followed closely by another vehicle that turned into her neighborhood behind her. The second vehicle was dark, generic, impossible to identify with certainty from the poor quality footage. It could have been coincidence, just another resident returning home at the same time. But the timing bothered me, the way it maintained distance while following the same route, the way it disappeared from view just as her car turned toward her street. I canvassed the neighborhood again, this time asking specifically about unfamiliar vehicles, strangers, anything unusual during that final week. Most residents hadn't noticed anything, but the elderly neighbor across the street remembered seeing a car parked at the end of the street several evenings in a row. Dark car, 4 doors, looked new but not expensive, he said, closing his eyes as if trying to recall details from memory. Parked under the streetlight, but I couldn't see anyone inside. Just sat there for maybe an hour each time, then drove away. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, assumed it was someone visiting residents he didn't know well, or perhaps someone making phone calls who didn't want to be overheard at home. But the timing coincided with her changed travel patterns, with her increased research into missing person cases, with whatever had been building toward her eventual disappearance. I obtained a warrant to search her phone and computer more thoroughly, hoping to find communications I had missed, deleted files that might explain her state of mind during those final days. The tech department worked for weeks, recovering fragments of deleted searches, partial email drafts, browser history that painted a picture of someone preparing for something she couldn't, or wouldn't discuss with anyone else. The deleted searches were the most revealing. She had been researching how to disappear voluntarily, how missing person investigations worked, what mistakes people made when trying to vanish without trace. But she had also researched how people were abducted, what predators looked for in victims, how to recognize when you were being watched or followed. It was as if she had been preparing for two different scenarios simultaneously, disappearing by choice and being taken against her will. The research covered both possibilities with equal thoroughness, suggesting she didn't know which was more likely but wanted to be prepared for either. Among the recovered files, I found the beginning of what might have been a journal entry dated just days before her disappearance. The text was fragmentary, partially overwritten by other data, but readable enough to provide insight into her mindset. "I know someone is watching me. I've known for weeks, maybe longer. At first I thought I was being paranoid, seeing patterns that weren't really there. But the patterns are consistent, and paranoia doesn't explain the physical evidence. Someone has been in my house. Small things most people wouldn't notice, but I notice everything. A book moved slightly, a drawer not quite closed, the angle of my desk lamp changed by maybe 2 degrees. Someone is watching me, and they want me to know they're watching me." The entry ended there, cut off mid-thought by whatever process had deleted it, but it confirmed what I had begun to suspect. Her disappearance wasn't random, wasn't spontaneous, wasn't the result of personal crisis or voluntary departure. Someone had been stalking her, studying her, preparing for whatever happened in that house on the day she vanished. I returned to the house one final time, armed with this new understanding, looking for evidence of intrusion rather than departure. The rotated chair took on new significance. Someone else had been sitting there, watching through the window, perhaps watching for her return. The missing candles suggested someone had been there long enough to need light, comfortable enough to bring their own supplies. In the basement, which I had searched perfunctorily during previous visits, I found something I had missed. A small window that should have been locked was slightly loose in its frame, not enough to be obvious, but enough to allow entry by someone who knew exactly how to manipulate it. The surrounding area showed microscopic scratches consistent with repeated opening and closing. The basement itself was finished, used as storage and laundry area, filled with the accumulated possessions of someone who lived alone and saved things just in case they might be useful someday. But behind a stack of boxes, I found a space just large enough for someone to hide, to wait, to observe the house's routine from inside. The space contained traces of recent occupation, indentations in the dust where someone had sat, a few crumbs from snack foods, the faint scent of cologne that was different from anything I had found in her personal belongings. Someone had been using her basement as an observation post, coming and going through the loose window, studying her habits from inside her own home. The investigation stalled there, suspended between evidence and proof, between suspicion and certainty. I had established that someone had been stalking her, that she had been aware of the stalking, that she had been researching both escape and survival strategies. But I couldn't identify the stalker, couldn't trace their movements beyond those few glimpses on surveillance footage, couldn't determine exactly what had happened during those final hours. The case remains open, filed among other investigations that have exhausted their obvious leads but refuse to be closed. Her house stands empty, maintained by her sister who hopes she might someday return but grows less optimistic with each passing month. The neighborhood has returned to its normal rhythm of lawn mowers and dog walks and children playing in driveways, but the residents still lock their doors more carefully and pay closer attention to unfamiliar cars parked under streetlights. I think about her often, about the research she conducted into her own future disappearance, about the careful preparation that couldn't prevent whatever happened to her. I think about the stalker who knew her routine well enough to enter her house undetected, who watched her from her own basement, who planned something that left no trace except absence. Sometimes I drive past her house, noting that the lawn is still maintained, that her sister still checks the mailbox hopefully, that the chair in the living room has been returned to its proper position. The house looks normal now, unmarked by the mystery it contains, indistinguishable from the others on the street where people live their lives without knowing they're being watched. But I know someone is still out there, someone who planned and executed a perfect disappearance, someone who studied their victim carefully enough to leave no evidence except the evidence of careful study itself. They're probably watching someone else now, learning new routines, preparing for another vanishing that will leave investigators with questions but no answers. The scent of extinguished candles still haunts my dreams, a reminder that some mysteries resist solution not because the evidence is insufficient, but because the truth is more disturbing than we're prepared to accept. Somewhere in another basement, in another house, in another neighborhood that feels safe until it isn't, someone is watching and waiting and planning the perfect disappearance of someone who doesn't yet know they're already gone. Story 2. It rustled softly like leaves brushing against each other in a windless room. I stopped at the threshold, the sensation oddly familiar, yet adrift from the place I stood. The sound seemed to seep from the walls, an echo of autumn, conjuring images of sprawling backyards and overgrown trails. I turned my gaze to the window, half expecting to see them gathered there, but the glass only reflected the stillness of an empty room. Just last week I'd swept this very floor, watched each leaf deftly collect in the pile. Now, under the dim ceiling light, a subtle shiver trickled through me as the whisper grew closer, a reminder of something misplaced. I shouldn't have heard that here, but it lingered. The coffee cup sits on my kitchen table, cold now, a thin film across the surface. I remember pouring it, steam rising in careful spirals, but that was hours ago or maybe yesterday. Time has become elastic here, stretching and contracting like something alive. The woman next door mentioned she hadn't seen the mailman in 3 days. I nodded, though I couldn't recall the last time I'd checked my own box. There's a pattern in the way shadows fall across my bedroom wall each evening. They form shapes that remind me of hands reaching, fingers splayed against the plaster. I've measured the angles, traced them with my finger when the light fades. The measurements never match what I remember from the night before. I found the first photograph tucked inside a library book I'd never borrowed. Black and white, slightly blurred. A figure standing beside a car I didn't recognize in a place I'd never been. The back was blank except for a smudge that might have been a fingerprint. I kept it anyway, slipped it between the pages of my journal where it wouldn't get lost. The detective asked if I'd noticed anything unusual. I wanted to laugh. Everything had become unusual, hadn't it? The way my neighbor's dog stopped barking at exactly the same time each night. How the streetlight outside my window flickered in sets of 3. The smell of cigarettes drifting through my vents, though I'd quit smoking months ago. She used to leave notes for me on the refrigerator, grocery lists, reminders about appointments, little drawings of flowers in the margins. I found one last week that I don't remember her writing. It said simply, "Check the basement," her handwriting unmistakably, but she's been gone for 2 months now. The basement smells of damp earth and something else, something organic and patient. I've been down there 4 times, each visit revealing details I'd missed before. Scratches in the concrete floor that form almost letters. A single earring beneath the water heater. Footprints in the dust that are too small to be mine. I called her sister to ask about the note. The conversation lasted 17 minutes. I know because I watched the clock, counted each second as she explained how grief could manifest in unexpected ways, how the mind creates what it needs to survive. Her voice was kind but careful, the way people speak to someone standing too close to an edge. The photograph multiplied. I found another in my coat pocket, then a third taped inside my mailbox. Same figure, different angles. In one, the person appeared to be looking directly at the camera, at me. The quality was poor, but something about the posture felt familiar, like a half-remembered dream. There are rules to this game I'm playing, though I don't recall agreeing to play. The rustling sound returns at predictable intervals. The shadows shift according to some internal logic. The photographs appear in places I frequent, as if someone knows my patterns better than I know them myself. I started mapping my daily routes, marking each location where I found evidence of this strange choreography. The library, the grocery store, the park where I sometimes sit to watch strangers feed ducks. Red pins connected by string, forming a shape I couldn't quite name. The woman in the photographs might be her, or it might be me. The angle makes identification impossible, but the clothes look familiar. A jacket I thought I'd donated, shoes I'm certain I threw away. I hold each image up to the mirror, comparing silhouettes, searching for definitive proof. My sleep has become fragmented, interrupted by sounds that shouldn't exist. Footsteps on the floor above, though I live on the top level. Doors closing in rooms I know are empty. The soft whisper of paper sliding under my door, though nothing is ever there when I look. The detective returned with more questions. Had I been in contact with anyone from her past? Did I have access to her personal belongings? Was I taking any medications that might affect my perception? I answered honestly, or as honestly as I could manage. Truth had become a moving target. I developed the habit of leaving small objects in specific places, testing whether they'd be moved. A pen beside my bedside lamp, a book open to page 93, a single key on the kitchen counter. Each morning brought subtle relocations, adjustments so minor they might have been accidents. The photographs led me to a storage unit across town. I don't remember renting it, but the key fit perfectly. Inside, boxes labeled in her handwriting contained items I'd forgotten we owned. Our old camera, rolls of undeveloped film, a journal I'd never seen before, filled with entries about watching someone who sounded remarkably like me. Her sister called to check on me. She mentioned finding some of her belongings in unexpected places. Items that had been missing now suddenly returned to their original locations. She wondered if I'd been redistributing memories, trying to create closure through careful curation. The journal entries were dated, but the dates made no sense. Some were from before we met. Others described events that hadn't happened yet or happened differently than I remembered. In one, she wrote about following someone who looked exactly like her, someone who lived in her apartment and wore her clothes. I photographed the photographs, creating copies of copies. The images degraded with each reproduction, losing detail until only shapes remained, shadows that could be anyone, anywhere, the mystery preserved through its own dissolution. The rustling sound has moved. It no longer comes from the walls, but from inside my chest, a gentle disturbance that matches my breathing. I've grown accustomed to its rhythm, the way it intensifies when I'm close to understanding something important. The detective's final visit was brief. The case would remain open, but active investigation was being suspended. There wasn't enough evidence to pursue any particular theory. She left her card, suggested I might benefit from talking to someone professional about processing loss. I found the last photograph tucked inside the journal's back cover. This one was different, clear, recent, taken from across the street. It showed me standing at my kitchen window, holding a coffee cup, looking directly at the camera, at myself. The expression on my face was one I didn't recognize, alert, expectant, as if I was waiting for something to begin. The woman next door mentioned she'd been hearing strange sounds lately, rustling like someone moving through dry leaves, though it was the wrong season entirely. She asked if I'd noticed anything unusual, and I told her I'd been hearing the same thing, but from inside my apartment, not outside where it belonged. Story 3. The chain rattled in place as I released it, the echo blending into the sea's rhythmic murmur. My fingertips brushed against the coarse metal, its chill lingering in the salty air. As the boat rocked gently, a sensation, neither hot nor cold, spread across my skin. There was an unfamiliar tension in the breeze, a muted insistence that prickled the hairs on my arm. Despite the sun's steady warmth, the world felt weightless, unanchored. The horizon seemed closer, its line sharper, and yet the water beneath the hull was impossibly still, like a held breath. Something pressed at the edge of my awareness, suggesting the presence of an unseen truth. I knew what had happened out here. The story was simple, clear as the morning light that cut across the deck where I stood. My brother had taken the boat out alone, just as he'd done countless times before. He was experienced, careful. The weather had been perfect, but somewhere between the harbor and the fishing grounds he knew so well, something went wrong. An accident, the kind that happens to even the most seasoned sailors when the ocean decides to remind you who's in charge. The Coast Guard found the boat drifting 3 miles offshore, engine still running, radio crackling with unanswered calls. His jacket hung on the back of the captain's chair, his coffee still warm in its mug. The official report called it an accidental drowning, likely the result of a fall overboard while checking equipment. Case closed. These things happen more often than people realize. I accepted this explanation because it made sense. Because my brother was the type of man who would lean too far over the rail to untangle a line, who would risk his balance to secure a loose fender. He was dedicated to his craft, sometimes recklessly so. The ocean had simply claimed another soul, as it had been doing for centuries. Standing here now, holding that same chain he must have handled on his final morning, I felt the weight of certainty. This was where it happened. This was where he slipped, where the water swallowed him whole. The boat had continued on autopilot until the fuel ran low, then drifted like a ghost ship until the authorities spotted it. A tragedy, but not a mystery. The sun climbed higher, casting shadows that shifted across the deck in familiar patterns. I'd been on this boat dozens of times, knew every rope and cleat, every storage compartment and safety device. My brother had taught me to navigate these waters when we were younger, patient and methodical in his instruction. He never took shortcuts, never ignored protocol. Safety first, he always said. Check your equipment twice, trust the ocean never. Yet here I was, trying to understand how such a careful man could make such a fatal mistake. The first crack in my certainty came when I opened the tackle box. Everything was wrong, not obviously wrong, not dramatically out of place, but wrong in the way that only someone who knew my brother's habits would notice. The lures were sorted by color instead of size. The spare line was wound counterclockwise. Small details that individually meant nothing, but together formed a pattern that didn't match the man I knew. My brother was obsessively organized, especially when it came to his fishing gear. He had a system developed over decades, a precise method for arranging every hook, weight, and swivel. He could find what he needed in the dark by touch alone. Yet this tackle box looked like it had been organized by someone else entirely, someone who understood the basics but missed the subtle logic that guided his choices. I told myself it didn't matter. Maybe he'd been trying a new system. Maybe he'd let someone else use the boat recently and hadn't bothered to reorganize everything. People changed their habits all the time, but the doubt had planted itself, a small seed of uncertainty that began to grow as I continued my examination. The logbook raised more questions. My brother recorded everything: weather conditions, fuel levels, engine hours, fish caught, mechanical issues. His entries were detailed and consistent, written in the same careful handwriting he'd maintained since childhood. But the final entry, dated the morning of his disappearance, was different, shorter. The handwriting seemed hurried, the details sparse. Just a few words about weather and departure time, nothing about his planned route or expected return. I flipped through the previous pages, comparing entries. The difference was subtle but unmistakable. This last entry felt like it had been written by someone else, or by someone in a hurry to appear normal while feeling anything but. The radio presented another puzzle. My brother was meticulous about maintaining contact with the harbor master and other boats in the area. He checked in regularly, reported his position, shared information about conditions and fish activity. But according to the Coast Guard report, there had been no radio contact that morning until the automated distress calls began broadcasting from the empty boat. Why would he break his routine? Why would a man who lived by maritime protocol suddenly abandon the very practices that had kept him safe for decades? I stood at the bow, looking out at water that seemed less peaceful than it had moments before. The gentle swells that had appeared so benign now suggested hidden currents, underwater obstacles, forces beyond my understanding. The sun felt hotter on my neck, the air thicker in my lungs. Maybe I was overthinking things. Grief has a way of making mysteries out of coincidences, of finding significance in random details. Maybe my brother had simply been having an off day. Maybe he'd been distracted or tired or dealing with problems I knew nothing about. People aren't always consistent, even the most reliable among us. But as I moved through the boat, touching surfaces he had touched, sitting where he had sat, the feeling of wrongness grew stronger. This wasn't just grief talking. Something had been different about that final morning, something that had altered his usual patterns and led to his disappearance. The more I examined the evidence, the less accidental it seemed. I found myself returning to the spot where I dropped anchor, where the chain had rattled through my fingers with such finality. The water here was deeper than I'd initially realized, the bottom invisible despite the clarity of the surface. How far down did it go? What lay hidden beneath that deceptively calm facade? The Coast Guard had searched these waters thoroughly, using sonar and divers and every tool at their disposal. They'd found nothing. No body, no additional evidence, no answers beyond the empty boat and the assumption of accidental death. But maybe they'd been looking for the wrong thing. Maybe the real story wasn't about what had fallen into the water, but about what had remained on the surface. I opened the cabin door and stepped into the cramped space below deck. The air was stale, tinged with the smell of diesel fuel and old rope. Everything appeared normal at first glance. Charts folded neatly on the navigation table, life jackets hanging in their designated spots, emergency equipment properly stowed. But again, the details felt wrong. The charts were folded incorrectly. My brother had a specific way of creasing maritime maps to preserve their integrity and ensure quick access to key information. These charts had been refolded by someone who understood their purpose but not their proper care. The life jacket that should have been hanging closest to the door was missing, replaced by one from deeper in the storage area. Most disturbing of all, the emergency flare gun was in the wrong compartment. My brother had drilled me on the location of safety equipment, emphasizing that in a crisis, muscle memory could mean the difference between life and death. The flare gun belonged in the compartment nearest the radio, easily accessible from the captain's position. But I found it tucked away with the spare batteries and first aid supplies, as if someone had moved it and then tried to hide it among less critical items. These weren't the kind of changes that happened gradually through normal use and minor adjustments. Someone had been through this boat systematically, touching everything, moving things around, trying to restore order without understanding the original system. Someone who wasn't my brother. The realization hit me with physical force. I sat down heavily on the narrow bench that ran along one wall of the cabin, my hands shaking as I tried to process what I was discovering. If someone else had been on the boat, if someone else had handled my brother's equipment and tried to cover their tracks, then this wasn't an accident at all. But who and why? My brother lived quietly, kept to himself mostly, had few enemies that I knew of. He was respected in the fishing community, honest in his business dealings, generous with his knowledge and assistance. He wasn't wealthy enough to be worth robbing, wasn't involved in anything illegal or controversial. He was just a man who loved the ocean and made his living from its bounty. Yet someone had been here in this space, handling his things with unfamiliar hands. I climbed back up to the deck, needing fresh air and open sky to clear my head. The sun had shifted position while I'd been below, casting new shadows across the cockpit. The water around the boat seemed darker now, more opaque, hiding its secrets beneath a surface that no longer appeared peaceful, but rather deliberately concealing. Standing where my brother had stood on his final morning, I tried to imagine what had happened. Had someone been waiting for him? Had they arranged to meet him out here, away from witnesses and potential help? Or had they followed him, stalking him across the water until they found the right moment to act? The questions multiplied faster than I could process them. If this was murder, where was the body? How had his attacker gotten away from a boat 3 miles offshore? Why hadn't there been signs of a struggle, blood, or damage that would have alerted the Coast Guard to foul play? Unless the killer had been very careful, unless they'd planned everything in advance, thought through every detail, anticipated every question that might be asked later. Unless they'd been smart enough to make murder look like an accident so perfectly that even the professionals had been fooled. I found myself studying the other boats visible in the distance, wondering if one of them contained the person responsible. Were they watching me now, seeing me discover what they'd hoped would remain hidden forever? Did they know that I was beginning to understand the truth about what had happened out here? The paranoia felt both irrational and completely justified. If my brother had been killed, if someone had gotten away with murder by making it appear accidental, then I was now a threat to their secret. My presence here, my investigation of the evidence they'd tried so carefully to obscure, put me in danger. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't pretend I hadn't seen what I'd seen. Couldn't ignore the growing certainty that my brother's death was no accident. He deserved justice, deserved to have the truth revealed no matter how dangerous that truth might be. I began photographing everything with my phone, the misorganized tackle box, the incorrectly folded charts, the displaced safety equipment. Evidence that might not mean anything to the authorities, but that painted a clear picture for someone who knew my brother's habits. Evidence that someone else had been here, had touched these things, had tried to restore order without understanding the system they were disrupting. As I worked, documenting each anomaly, I became aware of how isolated I was out here. The nearest boat was at least a mile away, too far to hear a call for help, too distant to witness whatever might happen next. I was alone on the water, just as my brother had been, just as vulnerable to whatever force had claimed him. The engine started easily when I turned the key, but even its familiar rumble couldn't dispel the growing sense of unease. I needed to get back to shore, needed to share what I'd discovered with someone who could help me make sense of it all. But as I began to raise the anchor, I found myself wondering if I was making a mistake. What if I was wrong? What if grief and guilt and the desperate need for answers had led me to see patterns that didn't exist, to find evidence of conspiracy in random coincidences? What if my brother really had just fallen overboard, and all these small inconsistencies had innocent explanations I was too distraught to recognize? The doubt was almost as troubling as the suspicion. I no longer trusted my own perceptions, no longer felt certain about anything. The man I'd thought I knew so well had become a stranger, his final morning a mystery that seemed to deepen with every answer I uncovered. But as the boat began to move through the water, carrying me back toward shore and safety, I knew I couldn't let this go. Whether I was right or wrong about what had happened, whether my brother had been murdered or had simply had the misfortune to fall victim to an unlikely accident, I needed to know the truth. The chain I'd handled so confidently that morning now seemed to mock my certainty. Its weight in my hands had felt like closure, like a connection to my brother's final moments. Now it felt like a question mark, a piece of evidence in a puzzle I was only beginning to understand. As the harbor grew larger ahead of me, I realized that my investigation was just beginning. The boat had revealed its secrets, but those secrets had only led to more questions. Who had been here? What had they done to my brother? How had they managed to make murder look so much like an accident that even I had believed it? The answers were out there somewhere, hidden among the people who knew my brother, disguised as innocent coincidences, waiting to be uncovered by someone persistent enough to keep digging. I was that someone now, whether I wanted to be or not. The truth had chosen me as its instrument, and I would follow wherever it led, no matter how dark that path might become. The water beneath the hull whispered secrets I couldn't yet understand, but I was learning to listen. Story 4. I told them the door was closed when I arrived. Nothing unusual, just a regular night as far as they needed to know. Yet the faint aroma of burnt coffee hung in the air, mingling with the dampness of the recent rain. The chill that crept through the uneven floorboards seeped into my shoes, a reminder of the late hour and the tension in my shoulders. Shadows danced erratically, cast by flickering streetlights through the narrow window slits. A misplaced chair leg snagged my cuff for just a second, and beneath the dim glow, the dust across the shelves seemed to swirl in patterns I couldn't unsee. I never mentioned the chilly draft that whispered across my skin, nor the faint scrape that echoed in the silence. My fingers still tingled with a cold that wasn't entirely from the weather. The coffee cup sat exactly where I'd left it, or where I thought I'd left it. Memory plays tricks when you're tired, when you've been walking the same route for weeks, checking the same locks, counting the same steps. 17 from the front door to the counter, always 17. But tonight it was 18. I keep replaying that conversation with the detective, his pen clicking against his notepad, the way he tilted his head when I mentioned the missing photograph. Not missing exactly, moved. From the third shelf to the second, face down now, the frame slightly askew. He asked if I was certain about the position, and I nodded, though certainty feels like a luxury I can no longer afford. The photograph showed a woman I'd never seen before. Dark hair, kind eyes, standing beside a car that looked familiar but wrong somehow, like seeing your own reflection in a funhouse mirror. I'd stared at it for weeks, trying to place her face until it became part of my routine. Check the locks, count the steps, glance at the photograph. Now she was face down, and I couldn't bring myself to turn her over. There's a sound that comes at night sometimes. Not every night, but often enough that I've learned to expect it. A soft dragging, like something heavy being pulled across the floor above. The building is old, the walls thin. Reasonable explanations exist. People move furniture. People pace when they can't sleep. People hide things. I found the first letter tucked behind the radiator, the paper yellowed and soft from moisture. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, the kind you see in old journals or suicide notes. It spoke of watching, of waiting, of knowing things that shouldn't be known. No signature, no date, just words that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. The detective asked about the letter. I showed him the photocopy I'd made, kept the original in my jacket pocket where I could feel its weight against my ribs. He studied it with professional detachment, making notes I couldn't read upside down. When he asked if I'd found others, I hesitated. Truth is a slippery thing when you're not sure what you've seen. The second letter appeared in my mailbox, mixed between bills and advertisements. Same handwriting, same careful script, but this time the words were different, more urgent. They knew I'd found the first one. They knew I'd been counting steps, checking locks, moving through my routine like a ghost haunting its own life. I started keeping a journal then, documenting each strange occurrence, each misplaced object, each night when the dragging sound came from above. The pages filled quickly, too quickly. Reading back through my own words, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else had been writing them. The woman in the photograph had a scar on her left hand, barely visible in the faded image. I noticed it the last time I looked, just before someone turned her face down. The scar was shaped like a crescent moon, or maybe a smile, or maybe a wound that never quite healed properly. I have the same scar. Memory is unreliable, the detective reminded me when I mentioned this detail. Trauma can create false connections, patterns where none exist. He spoke with the practiced calm of someone who'd heard similar stories before, who knew the difference between evidence and paranoia. But he kept taking notes. The coffee cup had lipstick on the rim, faint, almost invisible, but there. A shade I'd never worn in a place I'd never been, except I had been there night after night, counting steps and checking locks and trying to understand why everything felt slightly wrong, like a song played in the wrong key. I washed the cup carefully, watching the pink stain swirl down the drain, but when I turned around there was another cup on the counter, and this one had my lipstick, the deep red I'd worn to work that morning. The red I'd worn when I first found the photograph of the woman who looked almost like me. The journal entries from last week contradict the ones from yesterday. Different handwriting, different perspective, as if two people were sharing the same pen. I read them over and over, trying to reconcile the inconsistencies, but the words shift and blur when I'm not looking directly at them. The detective suggested I might want to speak with someone, a professional, someone who specializes in stress-related disorders, in the way the mind can fracture under pressure. I nodded and smiled and promised to consider it, all while feeling the weight of the letter in my pocket, the one that arrived this morning with my name on the envelope and my handwriting on the page inside. The dragging sound stopped 3 nights ago. The silence is worse than the noise ever was. Now I lie awake listening to nothing, waiting for something that doesn't come. The absence feels heavier than presence, like holding your breath underwater until your lungs burn. I've been thinking about the woman in the photograph, about her kind eyes and familiar scar, about the way she stood beside that almost right car, smiling at something just outside the frame. Someone took that picture. Someone developed it, printed it, placed it on the shelf where I would find it. Someone who knew I would count the steps, check the locks, notice when things were moved. The detective called this morning. They'd found something, he said. Evidence that might explain the letters, the misplaced objects, the feeling of being watched. He wanted to meet, to show me what they'd discovered. His voice sounded different over the phone, cautious in a way that made my skin crawl. I agreed to meet him tonight at the same place where this all began, where the door was closed and the coffee was burnt and the shadows danced in patterns I couldn't unsee, where I first noticed that my routine had been altered by someone who knew it better than I did. The journal is almost full now, pages and pages of observations, theories, fears written in handwriting that sometimes looks like mine and sometimes doesn't. I've been carrying it everywhere, documenting each strange detail, each moment when reality seems to shift just slightly out of focus. But tonight I'm leaving it behind. The photograph is face up again. I don't remember turning it over, but there she is, smiling that almost familiar smile, standing beside that almost right car. The scar on her hand catches the light differently now, less like a wound and more like a question mark. I'm walking toward the door, counting steps out of habit. 17 to the counter, 18 back. The numbers don't add up, but then again, they never did. The detective will be waiting with his notepad and his questions and his professional concern for my well-being. I wonder if he'll recognize the woman in the photograph. The coffee cup is clean now, sitting in exactly the right spot. No lipstick, no stains, just ceramic and shadow and the weight of things unseen. The letters are still in my pocket, all of them, even the ones I haven't written yet. Outside, the streetlights flicker in their familiar pattern, casting shadows that dance and shift and whisper secrets I'm only beginning to understand. The rain has stopped, but the dampness lingers, seeping through the floorboards and into my bones. I told them the door was closed when I arrived, and maybe that was true. But I never mentioned whether it was locked from the inside or the outside, and now, as I reach for the handle, I realize I'm not sure which side of the door I'm really on. Story 5. The kettle whistled, but no steam rose. The kitchen felt off-kilter, pieces of its essence leaning an invisible slant unnerved the morning. The refrigerator hummed a semitone lower, a discord I hadn't noticed until now. On the table, the bread was untouched, yet crumbs scattered over its surface like ants. I watched my hand move to swipe them away, though no motion followed. I hadn't reached for it, not once. But the sink tap dripped again, a testament to a turn never made. That sound, always that sound. I'm trying to remember when it started. The dripping, was it before or after? My mind keeps circling back to water, always water. The way it pools in corners where it shouldn't be. The way it finds cracks in places that were never broken. There was someone in the house. I think there was someone in the house. But when I try to focus on faces, they blur like watercolors in rain. Voices drift through the walls, conversations I might have had or might have overheard. The words scatter before I can catch them. Did you check the basement? Whose voice was that? Mine. It echoes wrong, like it's coming from inside my chest instead of my throat. I don't remember asking that question, but I remember the silence that followed. Heavy silence, the kind that presses against your ears until they pop. The basement, why would I check the basement? My feet know the stairs better than my mind does. 13 steps down, the 7th one creaks, always the 7th one. But sometimes when I count there are 14, sometimes 12. The number changes, but the creak stays the same, a wooden sigh that sounds almost human. In the corner there's a box, was a box, is a box. Time moves strangely down there, like walking through honey. The cardboard is soft with moisture, edges dark and curling. Inside, photographs stick together, faces melting into each other until I can't tell where one person ends and another begins. But there's one photo that won't stick. It slides free every time I try to put it back. A figure standing by a window, backlit so the features disappear into shadow. Could be anyone, could be no one, could be me, but I don't remember posing for it. The window in the photo looks familiar. Same curtains as upstairs, same crack running down the left side of the glass. But when I go to check, the crack is on the right side, or maybe there's no crack at all. Memory is a liar, especially when it's frightened. The water's been running for hours. There's that voice again, definitely not mine this time, too deep, too certain. But when I turn around, the basement is empty except for shadows that seem to move when I'm not looking directly at them. The light bulb swings on its chain, casting patterns that make no sense. Upstairs, the tap is still dripping, always dripping. I try to turn it tighter, but my hands pass through the handle like it's made of mist. Or maybe my hands are the mist. It's hard to tell the difference between what's real and what's remembered when everything feels equally distant. The phone will ring. The sound cuts through the house like a blade, sharp and insistent. But when I reach for it, there's only the echo of my own movement, the ghost of intention without action. Hello. I might have said that, someone said that. The word hangs in the air, waiting for an answer that never comes. Or maybe it did come and I've forgotten how to hear it. My ears feel stuffed with cotton, with water, with the weight of things I don't want to remember. There are footprints on the floor, wet footprints leading from the kitchen to the back door. They're too big to be mine, too small to be anyone else's. The water in them reflects light that isn't there, gleaming like oil in the dark. I follow them because I have to, because they're leading somewhere I've been before, somewhere I need to go again. The back door is open, has always been open, will always be open. The screen hangs loose on its hinges, torn fabric fluttering like skin. Outside, the yard stretches in directions that don't match my memory. Too long in some places, too narrow in others. The garden hose lies coiled by the steps, but water still flows from its end, pooling in the dirt until the ground turns to mud. Someone was watering the plants. Someone is always watering the plants. But the plants are brown, have been brown, were never anything but brown. Dead things that refuse to fall down. They need more water. The voice comes from behind me, but when I turn, there's only the open door and the darkness beyond it. Inside, the kettle is whistling again, always whistling, never stopping. I go back inside because I have to, because the sound pulls me like a rope around my chest. The kitchen looks different now, smaller somehow. The walls have moved closer together, or maybe I've grown larger. Everything feels pressed in, compressed, like being underwater. The kettle sits on the stove, singing its shrill song, but the burner isn't on, has never been on. The metal is cold when I touch it, cold as river stones, cold as winter mornings, cold as things that have been buried too long. Steam should be rising, there should always be steam. But the air above the kettle is empty, clear, honest in a way that makes my chest tight. In the refrigerator, food sits untouched. Milk that never sours, bread that never molds, fruit that never ripens. Everything suspended in a moment that refuses to pass. Time has gotten stuck here, caught like a fish in shallow water. I open the freezer and cold air spills out, but it doesn't feel cold. It feels like nothing, like the absence of temperature, the absence of sensation. Ice crystals coat the walls, but they don't melt when I breathe on them. There's something in the back wrapped in white paper. I know it's there without looking, have always known it's there. But my hand won't reach for it, won't move past the frozen peas and the ice cream container that's been empty for longer than I can remember. The paper crinkles when the freezer door closes, crinkles like leaves, like fire, like whispers in empty rooms. The sound follows me as I walk away, echoing in spaces that shouldn't echo. Upstairs, the floorboards remember footsteps I don't remember taking. They creak out a rhythm, a pattern of movement that maps a path I've walked but never chosen. From the bedroom to the bathroom, from the bathroom to the hall, from the hall to the window that looks out over the yard. The window is open, was open, will be open. Air moves through it, but it doesn't feel like wind. It feels like breathing, like the house itself is inhaling and exhaling around me, drawing me in, pushing me out, keeping me suspended between states. Below, the yard looks different from up here, smaller, darker. The hose still runs, still pools water in places where water shouldn't collect. But now I can see the pattern it makes, the way the moisture spreads in lines that almost look intentional. Like someone drew a map in the dirt, like someone was trying to tell me something. Can you see it now? The voice is closer this time, close enough that I can feel breath on my neck, but when I turn, there's only empty hallway stretching behind me. The walls are lined with photographs, but the faces in them keep changing. Smiling in one moment, serious in the next, gone entirely when I blink. One frame stays constant, empty glass reflecting nothing, showing nothing, holding nothing but the space where something should be. I've been avoiding looking at it directly, but now I can't look away. My reflection should be there, should be somewhere. But the glass shows only the room behind me, the hallway that leads to stairs that go down to the basement where the box waits with its photographs that stick together, except for the one that won't stay put. The circle is closing, has been closing, will always be closing. I go back downstairs because the kettle is still whistling, because the tap is still dripping, because water is still running from the hose outside and pooling in patterns that look like letters, like words, like messages written in a language I used to know. The kitchen feels smaller again, the walls have definitely moved. The refrigerator hums its discord, the same semitone that started all of this. Or maybe it didn't start here. Maybe it started in the basement or upstairs or outside where the water runs and never stops running. The bread on the table has more crumbs now. They move when I'm not watching, rearranging themselves into shapes that almost make sense, almost spell something, almost tell me what I need to know. But every time I get close to understanding, the kettle's whistle grows louder, drowns out thought, drowns out memory, drowns out everything except the sound of water that should be boiling but isn't, steam that should be rising but can't, heat that should be there but has never existed. The tap drips its steady rhythm, has been dripping since before I noticed, will keep dripping long after I stop listening. Each drop carries weight, carries meaning, carries pieces of truth that scatter like the crumbs on the table when they hit the basin below. I watch the water fall and remember falling, remember the feeling of gravity taking hold, of solid ground becoming uncertain, but I don't remember landing, don't remember the impact or the aftermath or the slow return to consciousness. Maybe I'm still falling, maybe I never stopped. The kettle whistles, but no steam rises. The sound cuts through everything else, through memory and confusion and the growing certainty that something here is wrong, has always been wrong, will always be wrong. And in that whistle, in that endless, impossible whistle, I hear something that might be my name, or might be a warning, or might be the sound water makes when it finally finds the crack it's been looking for all along. The dripping continues, the pattern holds. The truth waits in the spaces between drops, in the silence between whistles, in the gap between what I remember and what I'm afraid to know. Story 6. It rattled, soft and irregular, like a bead skittering across a hard surface. The kind of sound that should have been easy to place, yet here, amidst the rustle of leaves in the yard, it felt all wrong. My hand lingered above the open drawer in the kitchen, uncertainty making my chest tighten. I took a step back, trying to pinpoint the origin, but the house swallowed the sound whole, offering nothing in return. Instead, a flicker of memory, a toy on a ceramic floor, an empty nursery pulled at the edges of my mind. The air tasted stale, charged with something unspoken. I realized I couldn't just let it fade. The rattle had returned, asking to be noticed. I knew what it was, of course I did. The rattle belonged to the neighbor's child, the one who played in their backyard every afternoon. The sound carried through the thin walls of these suburban houses, drifting from room to room like an echo of normalcy. Children make noise. They drop toys, shake them, abandon them in corners where they roll and bump against furniture. There was nothing mysterious about it. The child lived next door with her grandmother. I'd seen them together in the garden, the old woman pointing at flowers while the little one toddled between the raised beds, clutching that plastic rattle with its faded yellow handle. The grandmother always waved when she caught me watching from my kitchen window. A pleasant woman with silver hair and careful movements, the kind of person who probably baked cookies and kept photo albums organized by date. The rattle was nothing more than a toy doing what toys do, making noise at inconvenient moments. It had probably rolled under their porch or gotten caught in the hedge that separated our properties. Wind could move small objects in surprising ways. Physics explained everything if you let it. I closed the drawer and returned to washing dishes, letting the warm water run over my hands. The sound of rushing water masked whatever other noises the neighborhood might produce. This was better. This was controllable. But something nagged at me as I scrubbed the plates. When had I last seen the child? The question arrived uninvited, settling in my mind like dust on an unused surface. I tried to brush it away, focusing on the simple task of cleaning, but it persisted. The grandmother still tended her garden. I'd seen her just that morning, kneeling beside the tomato plants with her small trowel. But the child, when had the child last been there? I set down the plate I'd been washing and looked out the window. The backyard next door appeared normal. A swing set stood in the center of the lawn, its chains moving slightly in the breeze. Toys scattered the grass, a plastic bucket, a stuffed animal that had seen better weather, a small tricycle turned on its side, evidence of a child's presence, but not the child herself. Maybe she was napping. Children napped in the afternoon. Or perhaps she'd gone inside to watch television or play with other toys. There were a dozen reasonable explanations for her absence, none of them requiring my concern or attention. Yet the rattle had sounded so close, not like something drifting from next door, but like something in my own house, something in my own kitchen. I dried my hands and walked through the rooms, listening. The house felt hollow, each footstep echoing off walls that seemed suddenly too high, too bare. I'd lived here for months, but the space still felt unfamiliar, as if I were visiting someone else's life. The previous owners had left behind traces of their existence, scuff marks on the hardwood floors, nail holes in the walls where pictures once hung, a lingering smell of vanilla candles in the hallway. In the living room, I paused beside the bookshelf. Something felt different about the arrangement of objects on the middle shelf. A ceramic bowl sat slightly askew, as if someone had bumped into it recently. Next to it, a small wooden box that I'd inherited from my aunt looked like it had been moved. The dust pattern beneath it didn't match its current position. I reached for the box, then stopped. My hand hovered in the air, fingers trembling with an uncertainty I couldn't name. The rattle sound echoed in my memory, but now it seemed to come from inside the box rather than outside the house. That was impossible, of course. The box contained only old letters and a few pieces of jewelry. I'd checked its contents when I first moved in, sorting through the remnants of my aunt's life with the methodical grief of someone trying to honor a memory. But had I checked everything, had I looked in every corner, beneath every fold of tissue paper? The afternoon light slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. The house felt suspended in amber, caught between day and night, between certainty and doubt. I found myself thinking about the grandmother next door, how she'd waved at me that morning. Her smile had seemed different somehow, less genuine than before, more careful. Had she been trying to tell me something with that wave? Had there been urgency in her gesture that I'd missed? I shook my head, annoyed with myself for entertaining such thoughts. Grief did strange things to perception. Since my aunt's death, I'd been prone to seeing significance in ordinary moments, finding patterns where none existed. The mind sought meaning even in meaningless things, especially in meaningless things. But the rattle sounded again. This time I was certain it came from inside the house, from somewhere behind me. I turned slowly, scanning the room for anything that might produce such a sound. The heating system could make odd noises, old pipes settling, the refrigerator cycling on and off. Houses were full of mechanical sounds that could be mistaken for other things. The sound repeated, and I followed it down the hallway toward the bedrooms. My footsteps seemed unnaturally loud on the hardwood floor. The walls pressed closer with each step, and the vanilla candle smell grew stronger, almost cloying. At the end of the hall stood a door. I rarely opened the room my aunt had used as a nursery decades ago, long before I was born. She'd never had children. The nursery had been prepared for a baby that never came, a hope that never materialized. After that disappointment, she'd closed the door and left the room untouched. Even in her final years, when she might have converted the space into something useful, she'd kept it sealed away like a shrine to possibility. I'd respected her wishes, leaving the door closed during my months in the house, but now it stood slightly ajar. The gap was narrow, perhaps an inch wide, but I was certain the door had been fully closed before. I approached it with growing unease, my hand reaching for the old brass knob. The metal felt cold beneath my palm, cold enough to make me pause. Through the crack I could see a slice of the room beyond, pale wallpaper with faded teddy bear patterns, the edge of what might have been a crib or changing table. And there, on the floor in a shaft of dusty sunlight, something small and yellow. The rattle. But that was impossible. The rattle belonged to the neighbor's child. I'd seen her playing with it dozens of times. It couldn't be here in my house, in a room that had been closed for months. Unless it had always been here. The thought arrived like a whisper, soft and insistent. What if the rattle had belonged to my aunt's never-born child? What if it had been waiting in that room all these years? A remnant of hope turned to memory, turned to dust. What if the sounds I'd been hearing weren't coming from next door at all, but from this forgotten space in my own home? I pushed the door open wider. The hinges creaked in protest, a sound like fingernails on wood. The nursery revealed itself slowly, a time capsule of faded dreams and careful preparation. A white crib stood against the far wall, its mattress still covered by a yellow blanket. A rocking chair sat beside the window, positioned to catch the afternoon light. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books and toys that had never been touched by small hands. And there on the floor, exactly where I'd glimpsed it through the crack in the door, lay the rattle. I knelt and picked it up. It felt warm in my palm, as if someone had been holding it recently. The plastic was worn smooth in places, suggesting years of use despite the room's apparent abandonment. When I shook it gently, it produced the same soft, irregular sound I'd been hearing all afternoon. But how could that be? If the rattle had been in this closed room, how had I heard it in the kitchen? Sound didn't travel through walls that way, especially not the soft sound of a baby's toy. I examined the rattle more closely. Beneath the faded yellow plastic, I could see small beads or pellets that created the noise when shaken. But there was something else inside, something that didn't belong. A piece of paper, folded small and wedged between the beads. My fingers worked at the toy's seam until it separated with a soft pop. The beads scattered across the nursery floor, rolling into corners and under furniture, but the piece of paper remained in my palm, waiting to be unfolded. The handwriting was my aunt's, though shakier than I remembered. The ink had faded to brown, suggesting the note had been written long ago. The words were simple, but they changed everything I thought I knew about the room, about my aunt, about the house itself. She visits every afternoon. I pretend not to see her, but I know she's there. The rattle was hers. She wants it back. I read the note twice, then a third time, trying to make sense of the words. Who visited every afternoon, who had owned the rattle originally. My aunt had never mentioned a child in the house, never spoken of anyone who might have played in this room. But as I sat there on the nursery floor, surrounded by scattered beads and faded dreams, I began to remember things I'd forgotten. Conversations with my aunt from years ago when I was young and she was still healthy. Stories she'd told about the house, about the family who'd lived here before her. There had been a child, a little girl who'd lived in this room, who'd played with toys and slept in the crib and filled the space with laughter. But something had happened to her, something my aunt had never explained clearly, speaking in the vague terms adults used when they wanted to protect children from difficult truths. The girl had gone away. That's how my aunt had phrased it. She'd gone away, and her family had moved out shortly after, leaving behind only the nursery and its contents. My aunt had bought the house as is, inheriting the room and everything in it, including the rattle. But if the child had gone away all those years ago, who was visiting every afternoon? Who was the little girl I'd seen playing next door with the grandmother? I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me. The afternoon light had shifted while I'd been in the nursery, casting new shadows across the room. The teddy bear wallpaper seemed to move in my peripheral vision, as if the bears were turning their heads to watch me. I walked to the window and looked out at the backyard next door. The grandmother was there, tending her garden as always, but I could see her more clearly now, see the way she moved with deliberate care around certain areas of the yard. She avoided the space beneath the large oak tree, never planting flowers there, never walking across that patch of ground. And I realized I couldn't remember ever seeing her and the child together at the same time. The grandmother worked in the garden during the morning hours, while the child played in the afternoon. They occupied the same space, but never simultaneously, like actors taking turns on a stage. The rattle in my hand felt heavier now, weighted with implications I didn't want to consider. I thought about all the afternoons I'd spent in my kitchen, washing dishes and watching the backyard next door. I'd seen the child playing, heard her laughter, observed her games. But had anyone else ever been present during those moments? Had the grandmother ever looked toward the child, ever called out to her, ever interacted with her in any way? I couldn't remember a single instance of such interaction. The realization crept over me like cold water. What if there was no child next door? What if the little girl I'd been seeing was the same one my aunt had written about, the one who visited every afternoon? What if I'd been witnessing something that existed in the space between memory and longing, between what was and what should have been? But that would mean the rattle had been moving on its own, producing sounds without anyone to shake it. That would mean I'd been seeing things that weren't there, hearing voices that had no source. That would mean the careful, logical explanations I'd constructed for everything were built on a foundation of impossibility. I left the nursery and walked back to the kitchen, still carrying the broken rattle. Through the window, I could see the backyard next door was empty now. The swing moved gently in the breeze, but no small hands pushed it into motion. The toys scattered across the grass looked abandoned, as if they'd been waiting for someone who would never return. The grandmother was gone too. Her gardening tools lay beside the tomato plants, but she was nowhere to be seen. The house next door looked hollow, its windows dark despite the afternoon hour. I set the rattle on the kitchen counter and stared at it. The yellow plastic seemed to glow in the slanted light, but whether from illumination or some internal source, I couldn't tell. The note from my aunt lay beside it, its brown ink spelling out words that refused to make sense in the world I thought I understood. What had I been seeing all these months? What had I been hearing? If the child wasn't real, if she existed only in the space between worlds, then what did that make me? Was I a witness to something impossible, or was I losing my grip on reality in the same way my aunt might have lost hers in her final years? The questions multiplied like reflections in opposing mirrors, each one generating new doubts, new possibilities. I thought about the grandmother's careful waves, the way she'd smiled at me each morning. Had she been acknowledging my presence, or had she been trying to warn me about something I wasn't ready to understand? Had she seen the child too? Had she been tending a garden that grew above something that should have remained buried? The rattle began to move on the counter, rolling slowly toward the edge. I watched it travel across the smooth surface, propelled by no force I could identify. It should have fallen to the floor, but instead it stopped just short of the edge, balanced precariously between falling and staying. Between presence and absence, between what was real and what was remembered, between the child who had lived and the child who continued to visit, afternoon after afternoon, asking for her toy back. I reached for the rattle, but my hand passed through empty air. The toy was gone, vanished as completely as if it had never existed. But I could still hear it, soft and irregular, like a bead skittering across a hard surface. The sound was coming from next door now, from the backyard where a child who might or might not be real continued her eternal play. And I understood that I would keep hearing it, keep seeing her, keep questioning what was possible and what was simply the mind's way of making sense of loss. The grandmother would continue waving from her garden. The child would continue playing in the afternoon light, and I would continue watching from my kitchen window, never quite certain which world I was observing, never quite sure whether the rattle I heard was calling me toward truth or away from it. The house settled around me with its familiar creaks and sighs. Somewhere in the walls, in the spaces between what was known and what was felt, the sound continued, soft and irregular, like a heartbeat that refused to stop. Like a question that would never find its answer. Story 7. I said I hadn't looked around much. They seemed to accept it, their pens scratching dutifully across paper as if recording every subtle deception. The hall carried a chill that settled in my bones, the draft whispering past my ears like a ghost's confession. Sunlight slanted through the high windows, casting long shadows that stretched and bent unnaturally. The air felt heavy, weighted with something unsaid, something lurking just beyond the edge of sight. My hands still tingled slightly, a memory of cold metal lingering against my skin. And as they thanked me, turning away with practiced indifference, I couldn't help but notice the faint outline of a fingerprint smeared across the dusty glass. The sound keeps returning to me, not the obvious sounds, the sirens, the voices, the heavy footsteps on wooden floors, something smaller. A soft clicking, rhythmic, like fingernails tapping against porcelain. I hear it when I'm washing dishes, when I'm lying in bed, when I'm standing in grocery store lines. Click, click, pause. Click, click, pause. It makes my teeth ache. She always wore that bracelet, silver chain with tiny charms that caught the light when she moved her hands. A miniature piano, a heart, something that looked like a key but wasn't quite right. The charms would knock together when she gestured, creating that soft, metallic whisper. I found myself listening for it in conversations, the way you might listen for rain on a roof. The basement door was open when I arrived, not wide open, just a crack, maybe an inch or two, enough to let the cooler air seep upward, carrying with it the smell of damp concrete and something else, something sweet and wrong. I remember thinking I should close it, but my hand hesitated on the knob. The darkness below seemed to breathe. They asked me about the timeline. When did I arrive? When did I leave? Did I see anyone else? Simple questions with complicated answers. Time felt strange that afternoon, elastic and unreliable. Minutes stretched into hours, hours compressed into heartbeats. I told them what I could remember, but memory is a liar dressed in truth's clothing. The kitchen window faced the woods, dense trees that blocked most of the sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight even on bright days. Sometimes I would catch movement between the trunks, a flash of color, a shifting shadow. Probably just deer or birds, probably. But I started closing the curtains anyway, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Her coffee cup was still warm when I touched it. The mug sat on the counter beside the sink, lipstick staining the rim in a perfect crescent moon. Steam rose from the dark surface in thin, wavering lines. I should have mentioned this to them, but the detail felt too intimate somehow, too private to share with strangers taking notes. I keep thinking about the photograph, the one tucked behind the others in the frame on the mantelpiece. You could only see the corner of it, just enough to make out part of a face, an unfamiliar smile. I wondered who had hidden it there and why. Some secrets are meant to stay buried, but others claw their way to the surface regardless of our intentions. The floorboards in the hallway creaked in a specific pattern. Third step from the wall, then the seventh, then a long stretch of silence before the final groan near the doorway. I learned this rhythm during my visits, unconsciously mapping the safe places to step. Walking through that house required a kind of choreography, a dance around its betraying sounds. Blood looks different than you expect, darker, thicker, more like chocolate syrup than the bright red of movies and television. It pools in unexpected ways, following the natural slopes and valleys of surfaces, creating abstract patterns that might be beautiful if you could forget what they represent. I found myself staring longer than I should have. The phone rang while I was there, 3 short bursts, then silence. The answering machine didn't pick up. I stood frozen, listening to the echo of those rings bouncing off the walls. Wrong numbers happen all the time, I told myself. People call and hang up for innocent reasons, but my skin prickled with goosebumps despite the rational explanation. She mentioned dreams in our last conversation, recurring dreams about drowning, about being pulled under by invisible hands. The water was always murky, she said, too dark to see what lay beneath the surface. She would wake up gasping, sheets soaked with sweat, the taste of pond water lingering on her tongue. I should have paid more attention to those words. The back door lock was broken, had been for weeks, maybe months. The mechanism would engage but wouldn't hold, leaving the house vulnerable to anyone who knew the right pressure to apply. I demonstrated this for them, pushing gently until the door swung inward with a soft sigh. They wrote this down with particular interest, their pens moving faster across the paper. Sometimes I catch myself reaching for my phone to call her. The muscle memory of friendship persists even when the mind knows better. My fingers find her number in my contacts, hover over the call button, remember. The silence that follows feels heavier than any conversation we ever shared. The mirror in the bathroom was cracked, a single line running from the upper left corner to somewhere near the center, creating a distorted reflection that split faces in half. Looking into it made me dizzy, unsure which version of myself was real. I avoided that room whenever possible, but the crack seemed to follow me anyway, appearing in other reflective surfaces throughout the house. They found the letter eventually. I knew they would. It was tucked inside a book on the shelf, something about gardening that no one would think to open. The paper was cream-colored, expensive, the kind you buy for special occasions. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, each letter formed with unusual precision. I recognized the words before they read them aloud. The cat came back on its own. 3 days after everything happened, it appeared at my door, thin and wild-eyed, meowing with desperate hunger. I fed it, gave it water, tried to coax it inside. But it would only stay for a few minutes before bolting back toward the woods, as if it knew something I didn't, as if it was trying to tell me something I couldn't understand. My shoes left prints in the dust, size 8 sneakers with a distinctive tread pattern, clearly visible on the hardwood floor. I pointed this out to them, mentioned that others might have walked through as well, but they seemed less interested in hypothetical footprints than in the ones they could actually see. Evidence has a way of speaking louder than speculation. The smell lingered in my clothes afterward, not just the obvious odors, cleaning products, old wood, that peculiar mustiness of houses that have been closed up too long. Something else, something that made people step back slightly when they hugged me. I washed everything twice, but the scent seemed to have seeped into my skin, becoming part of me whether I wanted it or not. She always said the house was too big for one person. All those rooms, all that empty space echoing with the sounds of a life lived alone. I used to think she was being dramatic, but standing in those vacant hallways, I understood what she meant. Loneliness has weight, substance. It fills corners and settles in shadows, growing stronger with each passing day. The garden was overgrown. Weeds had claimed the flower beds, vines strangled the fence posts, and something that might once have been roses had become a thorny maze of neglect. But in the center, one small patch remained carefully tended. Fresh soil, recent plantings, a border of white stones arranged in a perfect circle. Someone had been caring for this space while letting everything else decay. I think about the timing often. If I had arrived earlier, if I had stayed later, if I had chosen a different day entirely. The mathematics of tragedy fascinate and torment me in equal measure. How many seconds separate ordinary afternoons from the moments that reshape everything? How thin is the line between witness and participant? The investigators thanked me again before leaving. Routine courtesy delivered with professional detachment, but I caught something in their eyes, a flicker of suspicion or perhaps pity. They know more than they're saying, just as I know more than I told them. We are all keeping secrets now, locked in a dance of partial truths and careful omissions. Tonight I dream of clicking sounds and silver bracelets, of cracked mirrors and hidden photographs. I wake with the taste of coffee on my lips and the smell of damp earth in my nostrils. The The phone beside my bed remains silent, but somehow I know it's going to ring. Story 8. The draft. It felt like a cool breeze nudging my skin, though no window was open. I halted mid-step in the narrow hallway, 1 foot hovering above the faded carpet. The sensation repeated, brushing past me as though the air itself carried a message. I glimpsed the small vent near the baseboard, its slat slightly askew, letting through that faint chill. The memory of a similar draft seized me, a spectral touch I could never quite place. Each time it happened, a shadowy room from my mind unfurled, filled with uncertain shapes. The soft current seemed to pull at something deep within, unsettling in its familiarity. I had no choice but to follow it. The apartment building where I worked as a maintenance supervisor had become my second home over the past few months. Every creak in the walls, every stain on the ceiling tiles, every tenant complaint had become part of my daily routine. But this draft was different. It carried something with it that made my hands tremble as I knelt beside the vent. The metal grating came away easily, too easily. Someone had loosened the screws recently. Behind it, the ductwork stretched into darkness, but there was something else. A smell that didn't belong in the sterile air of the ventilation system. Sweet and cloying, with an undertone that made my stomach clench. I reached into the space with my flashlight, its beam cutting through the shadows. My fingers brushed against something soft, fabric maybe. When I pulled it out, I found myself holding a child's sock, small and pink, with tiny flowers embroidered along the ankle. The fabric was stiff with something dark that had dried long ago. The building's rental records showed that no families with young children had lived here in over 2 years. I knew this because I'd helped several tenants move out during that period, watching as they loaded their belongings into trucks and drove away to better neighborhoods. None of them had left anything behind, certainly nothing like this. I sat back on my heels, the sock weighing heavy in my palm. The draft continued to whisper past me, carrying that same unsettling scent. My mind began to catalog the tenants I knew, their faces and habits, the sounds that drifted through thin walls during quiet evening hours. There was the woman on the 3rd floor who always kept her curtains drawn, even during the brightest part of the day. She paid her rent in cash, always exactly on time, never complained about anything. When I'd knocked on her door to check a water leak in the apartment below, she'd opened it just wide enough to speak through the chain, her eyes darting past me to the hallway as if expecting someone else. The man in apartment 2B had moved in about 8 months ago, carrying only a single suitcase and a cardboard box. He worked irregular hours, coming and going at odd times. Sometimes I'd hear him pacing overhead when I was doing late maintenance work, footsteps that would stop abruptly whenever the building settled with its usual groans. I wrapped the sock in a paper towel and placed it in my toolbox, though I couldn't say why. Something about discarding it felt wrong, like erasing evidence of a presence that demanded acknowledgement. The vent cover went back into place, but I left the screws slightly loose, the way I'd found them. That evening, I found myself walking the hallways more slowly than usual, listening to the sounds behind each door. The building had always been quiet, but now the silence felt different, pregnant with secrets that pressed against the walls from within. The woman on the 3rd floor was cooking something that smelled of onions and herbs. Her television murmured softly, the sound of a talk show audience laughing at intervals. Normal sounds of normal life, yet my skin prickled as I passed her door. In the basement, I pulled the building's old files from storage, boxes of paperwork that previous supervisors had left behind. The records went back 15 years, filled with lease agreements, maintenance requests, and incident reports. Most of it was routine, but I found myself searching for something I couldn't name. 3 boxes in, I discovered a folder marked with an apartment number that no longer existed. According to the current floor plan, the space was part of the laundry room, but these documents suggested it had once been a separate unit. The lease agreement was signed in a child's handwriting, obviously fake, with a rental amount that wouldn't have covered utilities. Attached to the lease was a maintenance request filed by a tenant who complained about sounds coming from that non-existent apartment. Crying, the report said, usually during the early morning hours. The supervisor who'd taken the complaint had noted that the space in question was used for storage and had been unoccupied for years. The date on the report was 18 months ago. The complaining tenant had moved out 2 weeks later, breaking their lease without explanation. I made my way to the laundry room, studying the walls with new attention. In the far corner behind the industrial washing machines, the paint was newer than the rest of the room. When I ran my hands along the surface, I could feel the outline of what had once been a doorway, sealed over and painted to match the surrounding wall. The draft I'd felt upstairs seemed stronger here, though I couldn't locate its source. That same sweet smell lingered in the air, mixing with the scent of detergent and fabric softener. I pressed my ear to the painted-over doorway and heard something that made my blood freeze. A soft scratching sound, rhythmic and deliberate, like fingernails against wood. I jerked away from the wall, my heart hammering against my ribs. The sound stopped immediately, leaving only the hum of the washing machines and the distant rumble of the building's heating system. When I pressed my ear to the wall again, there was nothing. But the smell was stronger now, seeping through the paint and plaster like a memory that refused to stay buried. The next morning, I called the building's owner, a man who'd inherited the property from his father and rarely visited. He sounded distracted when I asked about the sealed apartment, as if he were trying to recall something from long ago. He remembered the space, he said, but couldn't explain why it had been closed off. His father had handled that renovation before passing away, and the records were incomplete. He gave me permission to investigate, though his voice carried a note of reluctance that made me wonder what he wasn't telling me. I spent the afternoon carefully removing paint and plaster from the sealed doorway. The work was slow and dusty, but eventually I'd cleared enough material to reveal the original door frame. The wood was water damaged and warped, as if it had been exposed to moisture for an extended period. Behind the false wall, I found a small room that had been gutted of everything except the basic fixtures. The floor was bare concrete, stained with dark patches that had soaked deep into the porous surface. The walls were covered with what looked like children's drawings, crude figures in crayon and marker that depicted scenes I couldn't quite decipher. In one corner, a pile of blankets had been arranged to form a makeshift bed. The fabric was moldy and damp, but I could see that the blankets had once been colorful, decorated with cartoon characters and bright patterns. Scattered among them were more pieces of children's clothing, small shirts and pants that had been worn thin with use. The scratching sound returned as I stood in the center of the room, but now I could identify its source. Mice had made nests in the walls, their tiny claws scrabbling against the interior surfaces as they moved through hidden passages. The sound was innocent enough, but in that context, it felt like an accusation. I photographed everything before disturbing it, though I wasn't sure why documentation felt important. The images looked stark and clinical on my phone's screen, failing to capture the oppressive atmosphere that made my skin crawl and my breathing shallow. Among the scattered belongings, I found a notebook with pages that had been damaged by moisture but were still partially readable. The handwriting was that of a child, practicing letters and simple words with the careful precision of someone learning to write. Mixed in with the alphabet exercises were other entries, fragments of sentences that made my hands shake as I read them. I was good today, but still no food. The man said I can come upstairs soon if I don't make noise. My tummy hurts and I can't remember my real name anymore. The entries were undated, but the paper's conditions suggested they'd been written months or possibly years ago. Some pages were too damaged to read, but I could make out enough to understand that someone very young had been kept in this room for an extended period. I sat on the concrete floor, surrounded by the remnants of a childhood that had been stolen and hidden away. The draft I'd first felt in the hallway seemed to originate here, carrying with it the weight of suffering that had soaked into the walls like the stains on the floor. The building's current tenants took on new significance in my mind. Someone had sealed this room, someone had hidden the evidence, someone had continued to live above this buried secret as if it had never existed. The woman with the drawn curtains, the man with irregular hours, the owner who'd sounded reluctant to discuss the renovation, any of them could have knowledge they'd never shared. I called the police from the sealed room, my voice echoing off the bare walls as I tried to explain what I'd found. The dispatcher's questions were routine and procedural, but I struggled to convey the horror of the discovery. How do you describe the feeling of standing in a place where innocence had been systematically destroyed? The investigating officers arrived within the hour, their faces grim as they surveyed the hidden room. They took their own photographs, collected the notebook and clothing as evidence, and asked me to recount how I'd made the discovery. My story about the draft and the child's sock sounded inadequate even to my own ears, but they listened without judgment. One of the officers, a woman with graying hair and tired eyes, pulled me aside as her partner continued documenting the scene. "How long have you worked in this building?" she asked. "About 8 months," I replied, "since the previous supervisor left suddenly." She made a note in her pad. "Did he give you any reason for leaving? Any problems with tenants or maintenance issues?" I thought back to my brief conversation with my predecessor, a nervous man who'd seemed eager to hand over the keys and disappear. He'd mentioned that the job was more stressful than he'd expected, but hadn't provided specifics. "He said the tenants were demanding," I said, but he didn't elaborate. "We'll need to speak with him," the officer said, "and we'll want to interview everyone currently living in the building. This is going to be a lengthy investigation." Over the following days, the building transformed into a crime scene. Forensics teams arrived with equipment I didn't recognize, taking samples from the hidden room and searching for evidence I couldn't imagine. The tenants were interviewed one by one, their normal routines disrupted by the presence of police officers and investigators. The woman on the 3rd floor answered their questions in a voice so quiet they had to ask her to repeat herself multiple times. She claimed to know nothing about the sealed room, though she admitted to hearing strange sounds occasionally. When pressed for details, she became evasive, her eyes darting toward the ceiling as if she expected to find answers written there. The man from apartment 2B was more forthcoming, but his cooperation felt rehearsed, as if he'd prepared for these questions long before they were asked. He provided an alibi for the time period when the room was presumably in use, though the investigators seemed skeptical of his precise recollections. I found myself studying their faces as they spoke with police, searching for signs of deception or guilt. But everyone looked uncomfortable under scrutiny, and I began to question my ability to distinguish between normal nervousness and genuine culpability. The forensics team's preliminary findings were disturbing but inconclusive. The stains on the floor were confirmed to be blood, but too degraded for DNA analysis. The children's belongings had been in the room for at least a year, possibly longer. Most significantly, they'd found evidence that multiple children had been kept in the space over an extended period. The investigation expanded beyond the building, encompassing missing persons reports and unsolved cases from the surrounding area. I watched from my apartment window as news vans arrived, their crews setting up cameras and interviewing neighbors who claimed to have always suspected something was wrong. But as the days passed, the investigation seemed to lose momentum. The forensic evidence was circumstantial, the witness statements contradictory, and the trail of responsibility impossibly tangled. The sealed room had been hidden so thoroughly that determining when it was created, who had access to it, and what had ultimately happened to its occupants became an exercise in speculation. I continued to feel that strange draft in the hallways, but now it carried the weight of unanswered questions rather than unknown secrets. The building's atmosphere had changed permanently, infected by the knowledge of what had been hidden beneath our feet. 3 weeks after my discovery, the investigation was officially suspended pending new evidence. The hidden room was sealed again, this time with official police tape and a padlock that seemed inadequate to contain what had been revealed. The tenants resumed their normal routines, but conversations in the hallways were stilted and brief. I kept the photographs I'd taken on my phone, scrolling through them during sleepless nights when the building's silence felt too heavy to bear. The images showed the physical evidence clearly enough, but they couldn't capture the questions that had taken root in my mind like invasive weeds. Sometimes I still hear that scratching sound from behind the walls, though I know the mice have been exterminated and the room is empty. Sometimes the draft carries scents that make me remember the child's sock I'd found in the vent, now tagged as evidence in a case that may never be solved. The building owner sold the property 2 months later, claiming the negative publicity had made it impossible to maintain occupancy. Most of the tenants moved out around the same time, scattering to new addresses where their histories couldn't follow them so easily. I was offered a position maintaining the new owner's other properties, but I declined. Some discoveries change you in ways that make returning to normal impossible. I found work elsewhere, in buildings with no hidden rooms and no buried secrets, but I've never stopped wondering about the children whose presence I'd felt in that draft. The case remains open in the police files, a collection of evidence and testimony that points toward a crime without identifying its perpetrators or victims. Sometimes I think about calling the investigating officer to ask if there have been any developments, but I'm not sure I want to know the answer. The truth is that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, not because justice doesn't matter, but because the complete truth might be more horrible than the questions it would answer. I learned to live with uncertainty, but I never learned to forget the feeling of that first draft against my skin, carrying whispers of suffering that demanded to be heard. In quiet moments, I still wonder if I could have done something differently, if I could have asked better questions or noticed important details that slipped past my attention. The children who lived in that hidden room deserved more than my accidental discovery and the failed investigation that followed. But perhaps bearing witness to their existence, even in this incomplete way, serves a purpose I can't fully understand. Perhaps the draft I felt was exactly what it seemed, a message carried on invisible currents, asking someone to remember what others had worked so hard to forget. The building stands empty now, its windows dark and its hallways silent. But sometimes when I drive past it, I imagine I can still feel that cool breeze, still carrying its burden of unspoken truths into a world that isn't always ready to receive them. Story 9. The faucet dripped twice, then halted unexpectedly. Shadows on the wall rearranged themselves in patterns I'd never noticed before, creeping sideways with a disjointed rhythm. Each step on the floor seemed to sink slightly, and the air thickened as if weighed down by something unseen. I pressed the button on the remote, expecting the usual static buzz, but only silence answered. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for the doorknob, feeling for the familiar chill that wasn't there. It should have been locked, but instead, it yielded without resistance. The coffee mug sat exactly where I remembered leaving it, yet the ring of condensation beneath had dried completely. Steam should have still been rising from the dark liquid inside, but the surface remained perfectly still, like a black mirror reflecting nothing. The ceramic felt warm against my palm, though I couldn't recall heating anything that morning. Or was it afternoon now? The temperature seemed wrong somehow, as if the mug had been holding heat from another time entirely. A photograph on the mantel caught my attention, though I'd walked past it countless times before. The faces smiled back with expressions I couldn't quite place. Had that person always been standing so close to the others? The arrangement felt different, more intimate than I remembered, yet the frame showed no signs of being moved. Dust outlined its exact position, creating a perfect rectangle on the wooden surface below. My fingers traced the edge of the glass, searching for some explanation that wouldn't come. The carpet beneath my feet held the impression of furniture that was no longer there. Deep indentations marked where a chair had once stood, though I couldn't remember moving anything recently. The fibers had compressed into permanent valleys, creating a map of a room that existed only in memory. I pressed my foot into one of the depressions, feeling how perfectly it matched something that should have been there but wasn't. Books lined the shelves in an order that made no sense to me now. Titles I'd never read sat next to volumes I could recite from memory, their spines creating a patchwork of familiarity and strangeness. One book lay open on the small table, pages yellowed and brittle. The words seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, rearranging themselves into sentences that felt both foreign and deeply personal. A bookmark protruded from between the pages, marking a passage I had no memory of reading. The telephone on the kitchen counter displayed a blinking light I hadn't noticed before. No sound accompanied the rhythmic flash, just a silent pulse that seemed to match my heartbeat. The cord stretched across the linoleum in a way that suggested someone had recently used it, though I lived alone and rarely received calls. When I lifted the receiver, the dial tone hummed with an unusual frequency, almost musical in its distortion. Windows throughout the house revealed a view that troubled me in ways I couldn't articulate. The landscape beyond looked exactly as it should, yet something fundamental had shifted. Trees stood in their proper places, but their shadows fell at impossible angles. The mailbox at the end of the driveway appeared closer than usual, as if the distance between us had somehow contracted overnight. I counted the fence posts along the property line, coming up with a different number each time. A drawer in the kitchen had been left slightly ajar, revealing contents I didn't recognize as my own. Utensils nestled together in arrangements I would never have chosen, their handles pointing in directions that defied the organizational system I'd maintained for years. A wooden spoon bore tiny scratches that told stories I couldn't remember. while a knife showed signs of recent sharpening despite my preference for dull blades. The mirror in the hallway reflected my face, but the expression looking back seemed to belong to someone else. My features remained unchanged, yet the eyes held a knowledge I didn't possess. The reflection moved a fraction of a second behind my actual movements, creating a subtle disconnection that made me question which version was real. Behind my shoulder, the hallway stretched longer than it should have, disappearing into shadows that hadn't been there moments before. Sounds from the basement drifted upward through the floorboards, though I hadn't been down there in weeks. Not quite footsteps, but something rhythmic and purposeful, like objects being carefully rearranged. The heating system couldn't account for the regularity of the noise, nor could settling wood explain its deliberate pattern. I placed my ear against the floor, feeling vibrations that suggested movement below, systematic and patient. A scent lingered in the air that I couldn't identify or locate. Not unpleasant, but unfamiliar in a house where every smell should have been catalogued and understood. It reminded me of something from childhood, yet remained frustratingly elusive. The odor seemed strongest near the closet in the spare bedroom, though opening the door revealed nothing but hanging clothes and stored boxes, all exactly where they belonged. The thermostat on the wall showed a temperature that contradicted what my skin was telling me. The digital display remained steady, but the air felt thick with humidity that shouldn't have existed in this climate. My breath came slightly shorter, as if the atmosphere had changed composition while I wasn't paying attention. The heating unit hadn't cycled on all day, yet warmth emanated from vents that should have been cold. Letters scattered across the desk in the study bore postmarks I couldn't decipher. The handwriting looked familiar, though I couldn't place the author or remember receiving any recent correspondence. Envelopes had been opened with surgical precision, their contents folded and refolded until the creases formed permanent scars in the paper. One letter lay partially hidden beneath others, its visible corner revealing words that made my chest tighten with inexplicable anxiety. The clock on the wall had stopped at a time that felt significant, though I couldn't recall why. Its hands pointed to an hour that seemed to echo in my memory like a half-remembered appointment. The silence where ticking should have been created a void that other sounds rushed to fill. Without the steady rhythm of seconds passing, time itself felt suspended, as if the house existed in a pocket outside normal flow. Dishes in the sink suggested meals I hadn't prepared. Plates showed remnants of foods I rarely ate, while glasses held the ghost rings of beverages I didn't recognize. The arrangement implied multiple people had dined recently, though I distinctly remembered eating alone. Silverware lay crossed in patterns that spoke of conversations and shared time, evidence of social interaction that contradicted my solitary existence. The bed upstairs remained unmade, but the wrinkles in the sheets told a story different from my restless sleep. Two distinct impressions marked the mattress, one clearly mine, the other belonging to someone whose presence I couldn't recall or explain. The pillow beside mine held the faint outline of a head, its fabric compressed in ways that suggested regular use. A warmth lingered there that my hand could still detect. Footprints in the dust near the back door revealed a traffic pattern that included shoes I didn't own. The treads pressed into the accumulated grime showed someone had entered and exited multiple times, their stride confident and familiar with the layout. My own prints appeared alongside these others, suggesting I had walked with this person, matching their pace and direction as if we shared some common purpose. The medicine cabinet in the bathroom contained bottles I didn't remember purchasing. Prescription labels bore my information, but the medications themselves were unfamiliar. Dosage instructions suggested a treatment regimen I had no memory of following, yet the pills showed signs of regular use. The dates on the labels fell within recent weeks, a time period I thought I could account for completely. A journal hidden behind other books contained entries in my handwriting that described experiences I couldn't remember having. The ink looked fresh, the paper crisp, yet the events detailed seemed to span months of activity I had no recollection of. Names appeared throughout the text, people I was supposed to know intimately, their characteristics described with the fondness of long familiarity. My own words painted a life parallel to the one I thought I was living. The garage held tools arranged with a precision I had never achieved. Every implement hung in its designated place, organized according to a system that spoke of regular use and careful maintenance. Oil stains on the concrete floor formed patterns that suggested recent projects, though I couldn't remember working on anything. A workbench bore the scars of activity, its surface marked by cuts and burns that told stories of creation and repair. Photographs tucked into the frame of a mirror showed scenes I should have remembered but didn't. My face appeared in each image, smiling and engaged with people whose names escaped me entirely. The backgrounds revealed locations that felt familiar yet strange, places I might have visited in dreams or in a life I had somehow misplaced. The timestamps on the backs of the photos fell within the past year, a period I thought I had lived in solitude. The answering machine blinked with messages from voices that spoke to me with intimate familiarity. They referenced shared experiences and inside jokes, conversations that apparently took place regularly. The callers assumed a relationship depth that contradicted my memory of social isolation. Their words carried expectations of responses and future plans, obligations I had somehow committed to without remembering the promises. A key hidden beneath a loose floorboard opened doors I hadn't known existed. The metal was warm as if recently used, its surface worn smooth by frequent handling. It fit perfectly into locks throughout the house, revealing spaces that had been sealed off or forgotten. Behind these doors lay evidence of activities and interests that should have been mine but felt completely foreign, like artifacts from someone else's life. The final element that caught my attention was the most disturbing, a second set of car keys on the kitchen counter, belonging to a vehicle I had never owned but apparently drove regularly. The keychain held personal mementos and the worn smoothness of daily use. Through the window, I could see the car itself parked in the driveway, its presence so natural that my eyes had skipped over it countless times. The driver's seat was adjusted to my exact specifications, and the radio was tuned to stations I enjoyed, yet I had no memory of purchasing, driving, or even seeing this car before this moment. Story 10. The drip from the faucet hesitated mid-drop, hanging in the air longer than it should. Familiar shadows seemed to inch away from their sources, stretching across surfaces like a photograph being developed. My footsteps echoed back in a sequence I didn't recognize, a rhythm out of rhythm. Each drawer in the kitchen stood slightly ajar, as if caught in the act of whispering secrets. I reached for the doorknob, my fingers brushing the cool metal, but it turned before I could. The ceramic mug on the counter still held warmth against my palm, though I couldn't recall making coffee. Steam rose in lazy spirals, carrying the bitter scent of grounds that had steeped too long. The handle bore a hairline crack I'd never noticed before, running like a fault line through the glazed surface. When I lifted it, the liquid inside moved with an odd viscosity, clinging to the sides as if reluctant to flow. The taste, when it finally touched my lips, carried undertones of something metallic and unfamiliar. Photographs lined the hallway wall in frames that seemed smaller than I remembered. Each image captured moments I recognized, yet couldn't quite place a birthday cake with too many candles, a garden where the flowers bloomed in impossible colors, faces that smiled with expressions slightly off-center from joy. The glass protecting each picture reflected my movement as I passed, but the reflection lagged behind, creating a brief double exposure of myself in motion. One frame hung crooked, and when I straightened it, the wall behind showed a pale rectangle where paint had been protected from years of sunlight. The telephone in the living room held the weight of conversations I couldn't remember having. Its black surface showed fingerprints that spiraled around the receiver in patterns too deliberate to be accidental. The cord coiled with mechanical precision, each loop identical to the last, as if someone had spent considerable time arranging it just so. When I lifted the handset, the dial tone hummed with an undertone that made my teeth ache. The rotary dial moved with resistance, each number clicking into place with the finality of a lock engaging. Sunlight filtered through the bedroom curtains in bands that divided the space into sections of revelation and concealment. The bed showed the impression of two bodies. Though I slept alone, had always slept alone, I was certain. The pillows held indentations that spoke of restless nights and dreams that left physical evidence of their passing. Dust motes danced in the light beams, following patterns that seemed choreographed rather than random. The dresser mirror reflected the room behind me, but the reflection included details I couldn't see when I turned around a chair that wasn't there, a door that remained closed. Books on the nightstand opened to pages I didn't remember reading, their margins filled with handwriting that looked like mine but felt foreign. The ink appeared fresh despite the yellowed paper, as if the words had materialized recently. Passages were underlined with increasing urgency, the lines growing heavier and more erratic as they progressed through each volume. One book fell open to a chapter about memory and its unreliable nature, the text seeming to shift and rearrange itself as I read. The bookmark, a pressed flower I didn't recognize, crumbled at my touch. The basement door stood open, though I made a point of keeping it locked. Cool air rose from below, carrying scents of earth and something sweeter, like flowers left too long in water. The wooden steps creaked under my weight in a familiar melody that triggered a sense of dread I couldn't explain. Each board gave slightly, as if the wood had grown soft with moisture and time. The handrail felt worn smooth by countless hands, though I rarely ventured downstairs. At the bottom, shadows pooled in corners where the single bulb couldn't reach. Cardboard boxes lined the basement walls, their contents labeled in handwriting that definitely wasn't mine. The letters formed words in a script too neat, too careful, as if written by someone trying to disguise their natural hand. Each box was sealed with tape that showed no signs of age or dust, despite the basement's obvious neglect. When I pressed my ear to one container, I heard a faint rustling, like papers being shuffled by an invisible hand. The labels read summer, autumn, before, but offered no indication of what seasons or events they referenced. A workbench occupied the far corner, its surface scarred by years of projects I couldn't recall completing. Tools hung in precise arrangements on a pegboard, each implement outlined in permanent marker to indicate its proper place. Several outlines remained empty, their corresponding tools missing from the collection. The wood surface bore stains that could have been paint or something darker, the marks forming patterns that suggested deliberate application rather than accidental spillage. A vice grip held nothing, its jaws adjusted to accommodate an object that was no longer there. The washing machine hummed with a load I didn't remember starting. Through the glass door, I watched fabric tumble in sudsy water that seemed too red to be soap alone. The cycle indicator showed 15 minutes remaining, but the digital display flickered between numbers as if unable to decide on the correct time. When the machine finished, the clothes inside were clean but unfamiliar items I didn't recognize wearing, in colors I didn't prefer. They smelled of detergent and something else, something organic and warm. Returning upstairs, I noticed the kitchen drawers had shifted position. Each one opened a different width than before. The cutlery drawer revealed knives arranged by size rather than function, their blades catching light from the window in brief, sharp flashes. One knife was missing from the set, the medium-sized utility blade I used most often. Its slot in the wooden block gaped empty, a reminder of something absent. The dishwasher ran a cycle on dishes that appeared already clean, the mechanical sounds masking other noises I couldn't quite identify. The living room furniture had been rearranged subtly, each piece moved just inches from its original position. The coffee table sat closer to the couch, as if someone had been reaching for items placed there. Magazines lay fanned across its surface, open to articles about missing persons and unsolved disappearances. The pages showed where patterns suggesting repeated reading, though I had no memory of purchasing these publications. A pen lay beside them, its ink matching the color of notes written in margins throughout each issue. The fireplace held ashes from a fire I didn't recall lighting, their gray remains still holding warmth when I held my hand above them. Among the charred debris, I found fragments of paper that had escaped complete destruction, corners of photographs, pieces of documents with partial words visible. The damper was open, allowing cold air to flow down the chimney and stir the ashes into small whirlwinds. The mantelpiece displayed items that seemed familiar yet rang a clock that ran backward, a vase filled with flowers that should have wilted weeks ago. My reflection in the bathroom mirror appeared tired in ways that sleep couldn't fix. The medicine cabinet contained bottles I didn't recognize, their labels printed in a font too small to read without strain. Each container rattled with pills when shaken, the sounds varying in pitch and rhythm like a pharmaceutical percussion section. The toothbrush holder contained 2 brushes, both showing signs of recent use. The sink bore water stains and patterns that suggested 2 people had been using the space regularly. The shower curtain hung with water droplets that caught light like tiny lenses, each one magnifying a different portion of the bathroom behind me. The pattern on the curtain abstract swirls in blue and green seemed to move when viewed peripherally, as if the design was swimming rather than printed. Towels hung on hooks with the precision of a hotel, folded and arranged by someone who cared about such details. The bath mat was damp despite the dry floor around it. Evening approached through windows that framed a backyard I barely recognized. The garden showed signs of recent attention, weeded beds, pruned bushes, fresh mulch around plantings I didn't remember making. A shovel leaned against the garden shed, its blade caked with soil that looked darker and richer than the earth visible in the flower beds. The grass showed patches where it grew differently, as if the ground beneath had been disturbed and reseeded. A sprinkler system I'd never installed ran automatically, casting water in precise arcs across the lawn. The garage contained a car I drove daily, yet its interior felt foreign when I sat behind the wheel. The seat was adjusted for someone slightly taller than myself, the mirrors angled for a different perspective. The radio was tuned to a station I never listened to, playing music that should have been unfamiliar but somehow wasn't. The odometer showed miles I couldn't account for, trips taken to destinations I couldn't remember visiting. In the glove compartment, I found maps with routes highlighted in red ink, leading to places whose names meant nothing to me. Dinner preparations began without conscious decision, my hands moving through familiar motions while my mind remained elsewhere. The refrigerator contained ingredients for meals I didn't recall planning, arranged with an organization that wasn't my style. Vegetables sat in crisper drawers, their freshness suggesting recent purchase despite my certainty that I hadn't been shopping. The freezer held containers of soup labeled with dates from the previous week, though I remembered eating takeout every night. The ice maker produced cubes that tasted of minerals and something else, something that made me think of deep wells and hidden springs. The dining room table was set for two, though I lived alone and expected no company. The second place setting included utensils polished to mirror brightness, a water glass filled to the precise level of my own, a napkin folded with military precision. The chairs were pulled out slightly, as if two people had just stepped away and would return momentarily. Candles in the center of the table had been lit recently, their wax showing the telltale drips of a flame that had burned for hours. The smell of extinguished wicks lingered in the air. As darkness fell, lights throughout the house turned on automatically, controlled by timers I didn't remember setting. Each room illuminated in sequence, creating a pathway from front to back as if guiding someone through a familiar route. The timing suggested knowledge of daily routines, an understanding of movement patterns through the space. Some lights flickered as they engaged, their bulbs apparently loose in their sockets. Others glowed with a warmth that seemed to pulse gently, like a heartbeat made visible. The front door lock showed scratches around the keyhole, small marks that could indicate repeated attempts to find the opening in darkness. The deadbolt turned with effort, as if the mechanism had been used more frequently than usual. Through the peephole, the porch light revealed footprints on the welcome mat, two sets overlapping, one distinctly smaller than the other. The mail slot had been used recently, though no mail had been delivered. The brass flap moved slightly in the evening breeze, creating a tapping sound that echoed through the entryway. Night sounds filtered through the house with unusual clarity, as if the walls had become more porous to outside noise. Footsteps on the sidewalk seemed to pause at the front gate before continuing, their rhythm matching the pace of someone familiar with the neighborhood. A car engine idled somewhere nearby, its motor running with the patience of someone waiting for a signal or a sign. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed hours that didn't match the time on my watch, its pendulum swinging with mechanical persistence through time that felt increasingly fluid. Sleep approached with reluctance, my mind cataloging inconsistencies that multiplied rather than resolved. The house settled around me with sounds that suggested occupancy beyond my solitary presence, floorboards creaking in empty rooms, doors closing with soft clicks, water running briefly through pipes before shutting off. My bedroom felt smaller in the darkness, as if the walls had moved closer while I wasn't paying attention. The closet door, which I always kept closed, stood slightly ajar, revealing nothing but deeper darkness within. The alarm clock beside my bed displayed numbers that seemed to change faster than seconds should pass, time accelerating toward a morning I wasn't certain I wanted to meet. Its red digits cast shadows on the wall that moved independently of the numbers themselves, creating a light show that mesmerized rather than comforted. The clock's ticking grew louder as the night progressed, each second marked with increasing emphasis until the sound seemed to fill the entire room. When I finally closed my eyes, the rhythm continued behind my eyelids, counting down to something I couldn't name but somehow knew was approaching.